Today on episode 62 of the Be a Marketer podcast, it's another Ask Dave episode.
But this one's a little different. It's an Ask Dave edition, where we're putting our very own Dave Charest in the hot seat for a change. We'll get a little deeper into that chuckle behind the mic, diving into his journey with Constant Contact and highlighting the importance of building authentic relationships. This is the Be a Marketer podcast.
Be a Marketer.
My name is Dave Charest, Director of Small Business Success at Constant Contact, and I help small business owners like you make sense of online marketing. And on this podcast, we'll explore what it really takes to market your business, even if marketing's not your thing. No jargon, no hype, just real stories to inspire you and practical advice you can act on. So remember, friend, you can be a marketer, and at Constant Contact, we're here to help.
Well, hello, friend. This is Kelsey. As you can tell, we're doing things a little differently today. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Be a Marketer podcast. So today, Dave, I wanted to change things up. I wanted to kind of reverse roles and ask you some more pointed questions, getting to know you, our host, a bit better. You're used to asking people about their businesses, getting to know them a bit better. So I wanted to kind of take time on an episode to get to know the man behind the mic.
Well, thanks, Kelsey. I have agreed to this, and we'll see if that was a mistake or not.
Hopefully I still have a job after this, so stay tuned.
I'm sure you will.
But yeah, so I just kind of wanted to get started with a bit of your background. I know that you were a theater kid, so I just kind of want to see how your involvement from theater and then to Constant Contact.
Yeah, sure. So I actually did not get into theater until college time, actually. I was actually a communications major, and I was at UMass Amherst for a while, and I was putting myself through school. I kind of ran out of money, so I took some time off. And then as I took that time off, I got this job. And then there was one day where I was actually working, slinging packages at one of the top package delivery services. And as I was doing that, I was looking down the aisle, sorting packages, and that was actually a really good job. It was like a part-time job with full-time benefits. But as I was kind of sitting there and doing my thing, I looked across and I saw like older people, like people like my age now. And I was like, this is not the direction I have planned, right, for what I want to do. And so I was like, all right, I got to figure something out. And so they had a tuition reimbursement program. If you worked like a certain shift, like the overnight shift, you could, get reimbursed for school. So I applied to the local community college, which, fun fact, this is where my wife teaches college now.
Shout out Reese.
Yeah, woohoo. And while I was going to school, it was a 2-year degree type of thing. So I was doing a journalism degree while I was there. And then I somehow got turned on to theater while I was there. And I had done like the high school play, but I had never really done any like theater stuff. Now, admittingly, I was kind of always I don't want to say the clown necessarily, but I was always funny, right? I was always making people laugh. Like that was kind of my thing. And like, growing up was like, what can I do to make sure everybody's having a good time? And yeah, got into theater, fell in love with it, got some leads in the shows that were being done here, had a really good relationship with the director that was there at the time. And I always think that's important, particularly as we've been having these conversations with customers and business owners, right? Finding the right people to work with, I think, is really important. And it's really interesting. I mean, even I think, Kelsey, you and I kind of finding each other to play off of and do these things that we do. It's all really important. And I like when you have those relationships that I think inspire each other to work hard and be better, I think is always important. And that was one of those relationships I had with the director there that was kind of heading up the theater department along with his wife. And yeah, I got really into it. And, it was one of those things where we could have a conversation. I'd be getting notes at the end, and it was like, yep, I know what you're going to say. I got it. Right. And I think that's kind of always been, I did sports in high school too. So I always had that mentality of like, how do you do better? And in theater, there's this like rehearsal process that you go through. And, it's one of those things that, right, okay, like how do I do something different, or how do you change something? And then the preparation piece of it that's involved with theater, I think also has played a big role into the work that I do here, is that it's all about preparation. and then kind of leaving that at the door when it's time to do the thing. And so that's why, I know that I'm very big on preparation, right? We're doing research on the guests that we talk to. We're doing this and that. I'm preparing a conversation guide, and I'm one of those people that I'm constantly running it through my head. Like, how do I want this conversation to go? Not that I'm trying to force anything, but I have a vision for what that may look like so that I can kind of moderate it or lead it in a direction, but also be open to, and this is the leave it by the door part, where do you leave it by the side so that you can follow the threads of where the conversation goes? So this was a long way to get to. Started in theater at that time. And then, like I said, got really into it. And then I was starting to look at, okay, what do I do after this? And I had applied to some local schools. I actually got a full scholarship for theater to go to a local college out here. But I was like, if I'm going to do this, and I was at a point in my life where I was like, I wouldn't mind just getting away from home. Right. And, grew up in this Boston area. And so I moved to New York, and I got partial scholarships to go to school in New York, did that, and then worked as an RA and all of that kind of stuff to help kind of, finish it out. But that was kind of my path. And then after graduating school, I was doing theater stuff. Near the end of that time in school, I actually met another group of friends who we started a band. And so we got really into playing music.
What was your role in the band?
At the time, I was a bass player. And so that was one of the things I actually picked up when I was at UMass Amherst, where a friend of mine sold me his bass for $5. He was like, hey, do you want to buy my bass? And I was like, yeah. I'm like, how much? He's like, $5. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, you always seem to like playing it. So I figured, I'm not really playing it much. So because he was more of a guitar player, I was like, thanks. And so that began the boom, 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 boom all the time. But that's also another thing where I guess my personality is, if anybody knows me, and my wife will tell you that I kind of get obsessed with a thing, and then I want to learn how to master that thing as best as I can, right? And do that. And so I'm one of those people that I can get, I don't want to say complacent, but I get comfortable. And I was very good at compartmentalizing work and outside of work life. And so work was just the thing I did to make money at that time. And but it got to a point, at this point, I had met my wife, Reese, who you mentioned, she's born and raised in Brooklyn. And then we were actually both working there at the same time for a little while. And it got to a point where we had just had the girls. So I have twin girls, for those of you who don't know, but I think I've mentioned before, who are 19 now, which blows my mind. But it got to this point where I was more involved in a little bit more of the craziness that was happening. And it became a little bit more difficult to separate the two, right? The professional and the personal life. And it got to a point where it was impacting my personal life. And I was cranky. And, I was taking it out on Reese and, and the kids and all that stuff. And they were young. And it was just like, I got to figure something out. At the time, this would have been, I want to say 2005, 2006 timeframe, where the internet was really starting to kind of take off. And I then was like, all right, I'm into this. In high school, I participated. And I don't know if you know this, actually, Kelsey. This might be something you're actually familiar with. But have you ever heard of DECA? Do you know what that is when I say that?
No.
So it's short for Distributive Education Clubs of America. Okay. And it's I almost want to say it's almost like a vocational thing, but for marketing. And so, and so I ended up becoming the president of this club.
Of course.
And yeah, of course I did. And so, shut up. No, so and again, a similar situation where the teacher was really amazing and I had a good relationship with the teacher, right? I guess a theme in here is a lot of this really boils down to, as I'm saying it out loud, right, boils down to relationships with me, right? And so, which I think is funny because this is what we talk about with marketing all the time, right? Is that's really what it is. And so I, surprise, got really good at this marketing stuff in high school. And I competed at the national level in these competitions that they would have. And I was the first person in the school to do this in many, many years. And so we got a trip to California to go compete at the national level and do all this stuff. And so, but then I never really kind of followed that path. It was just, I was good at communicating, hence my going into communications. And I liked to, I was always the one, even when I was working at the physical therapy office, where it's like, hey, we need to write something, and be like, here, give it to Dave. Dave will write it. So I was always that person. And so again, I got intrigued by the potential in what the internet was really offering, in particular as social media was starting to take off. And I was kind of a late bloomer in terms of like, I wasn't like on like Friendster or what was the other one? The one with the crazy pages? MySpace, right? Like Reese did all that stuff. And I was like, nah, I'm not interested. I'm good. Thanks. And then I think at one point somebody convinced us to start a Facebook profile or whatever. And I was on there and that was probably the least interesting of things. But what I thought was really interesting was how this really in many ways like allowed you to have a voice in a space that you could then connect with people that shared similar interests and do all of that. And then, having that theater background, I started to kind of learn more about like online marketing. So I was following things like, Copy Blogger was a big thing back then. I met someone, Sean D'Souza, who had a site called Psycho Tactics, which I learned a real lot from during those days. So it was like those two were kind of my go-to places to kind of start to figure this stuff out. And then like I started a blog, like I started doing all of those online marketing moves, which I think these things are a little bit different today. But back then it was, I don't want to say it was easy, but there was more engagement and real conversation. I think, today, if you look at what's happening, a lot of it can be, somebody's commenting so that they can promote themselves, a lot of that kind of stuff, where this was actually really more about just making connections and doing those things. And so as I was learning and going through this stuff and learning particularly how important email marketing would be and is in the online marketing kind of arena as a whole, I started looking at, again, I come from a theater background, and I was starting to, one, you would get emails from friends who were doing shows, and then you would always get this random email out of the blue, like, hey, I'm in a show, come see the show. And then I started subscribing to a bunch of different theater groups and things like that and seeing what they would send. And then similar, right? They were just sending emails to say like, hey, come see the show. And I was like, wow, this is such a missed opportunity, because what you want to do is really kind of bring people along, like communicate and tell stories and share what's going on with the thing. So I came up with the phrase for this called the journey factor. And I started kind of pitching this and kind of building on this idea. And I kind of positioned it like, so I positioned it as like, imagine you were given free tickets to see a show. And there was a stipulation to going to the show with the free tickets. And it was like the hottest show on Broadway. And you could only watch the last 2 minutes of the show. So that was the stipulation, right? So you go in and you're watching the last 2 minutes and like the main character dies in these last 2 minutes and everyone's bawling their eyes out and crying. And you're just sitting there like, what is going on? Right? And the reason you're there doing that is because you don't have the same connection as everybody else had to the character, because they were there for the journey that this character went on.
Yeah.
And I would say to people like, now that situation is a lot similar to what you're doing by just sending people to, hey, buy tickets, right? Like you've been going through this whole journey that no one is involved in, and you're just giving them the last 2 minutes and saying, hey, come see this show.
No, that's a really great example.
Right. And so instead, what you should do is, and I think this even applies today because it's all about storytelling, and theater people have like this aversion to marketing anyway. Right. And I'm like, no, like business people would love to be able to tell stories the way you can as a professional in telling stories. You've actually got the skill set, and all you're saying is buy tickets. Right. And so I would walk people through this idea of, and at one point, I became the marketing director of a theater out in Astoria, which really gave me the opportunity to start to apply, the theoretical stuff that I was doing, for myself, but also apply it to that setting. And what we did is, instead of saying, again, buy tickets, it was, hey, here's the season we're planning for you. And then we would have a letter from the executive director who would explain the full thing. Then we would talk to the artistic director, and he would share his vision for each of the different shows. Then we would have the director on who was directing a show. Then we would talk to the costume people, the actors, right? We would build all of this stuff so that 3 months from the opening night of this show, we were sharing little bits and pieces of how this show was developing. And everybody on these lists are theater people who love this stuff. And then so we would get to this point where, and then the other thing I think was really interesting, what we did was, instead of just saying, here, buy tickets, we focused everybody on the weekend. And so we would say, buy tickets for this weekend. And we would put those 3 dates on to drive people to a particular weekend. so that we would get more people buying there versus just letting them kind of pick where they wanted. Now, that didn't mean people didn't buy tickets at other times, but again, it focused the action where we wanted to go. And that worked really well for us. And we did the same thing with like volunteers. I actually ran a program that was like a playmaking course for young kids. And so the kids would write plays, and then we would get professional actors to come in to perform their plays. It was so much fun.
Oh, that's so fun.
I kind of used that same approach in my communications with the people that were, so like, here's when we're going to have rehearsal. Here's what you need to know now. Here's your play. Like, so like really kind of doling that out over time and giving people, which I think is important to do today, kind of only the information that they need to know right now. So there's something that they can act on and do versus trying to give everybody all of the information. So long way to get to. I started doing that. I parlayed that into, I had some speaking things that I ended up doing, like webinar type things. And then I was, got the opportunity to work as, the marketing director at the theater. And at a certain point, my wife and I, we were like, look, if I was being honest, I learned real fast that, hey, I was really good at this marketing stuff, not so great at the business side of things, right? Like managing that. And I think even for me, my mental health was not good, right? Like, because I thrive on collaboration and being around people and doing all of those things, which is why it's nice that we're kind of hybrid now, right? Because I like that flexibility, but it just wasn't sitting well with me, right? Like, because I wasn't able to kind of thrive in the areas that I needed to, because and then like the things that I don't enjoy doing, which I'm sure many business owners can agree to, kind of suck your energy, right? And so it was putting me in a weird place. So we had made the decision to move back to the Massachusetts area because we had the girls were young, and, I had more family out here, and we made that decision. And I actually I had a friend who was hooking me up with a job selling copy machines.
Oh.
Yeah. And so I was like, all right, whatever I need to do to get there, right? Because that's the type of person I am. You do what you got to do to get to where you need to be, and then you figure it out, right? And so that was the plan. Until one day I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw a buddy of mine that I went to college with at UMass Amherst, and he had worked at Constant Contact. And I think he was on the community side of things at the time. And I was like, oh, Constant Contact. I'm like, I mean, that's actually this marketing stuff that I've been talking about, email marketing. Like, I should see if they've got something going on there. I didn't realize it was in Massachusetts. And so I looked on the site, and there was a role for a content developer. And I always kind of tell this as it was the job description read as if it was like, Dear Dave, do you do these things? And I'm like reading these things, and it was like this and that. And I'm like, yep, yeah, I do that stuff, right? And I was like, oh, this is cool. I'm like, this would be amazing because this is like a business that does all the things that I'm talking about. I have been a business owner, and I have taught myself how to do all of these things. So I get it from that like internal level. And I think that's probably another thing about me that's important, is that like coming from that theater background, for me, it's all about kind of internalizing the stuff. And once I get it in me, like then it comes out, right? Like in a way that I can do things with. So I reached out to him and I was like, hey, do you know if this job is still open? And he was like, let me connect you with the hiring manager. Reached out to her, had a little email conversation, applied for the role. We had a 15-minute phone call. I got off that phone call and I said to Reese, my wife, I said, I mean, I'm going to get that job. Because we just had the best conversation. And like I was able to share all of these ideas and all of the things that I've been doing and all of the things that I was excited to implement in a time where like they had a blog, but it wasn't really doing anything. It was like one of those types of things. Right. And so then within 2 weeks, I had come back to Massachusetts to meet with a bunch of people. And then I got the job. And then I had my kids enrolled in school. And then we moved back. We rented my dad's house to live in for a while. And Reese was still finishing because she was teaching out there. And so she was finishing up. So we were kind of apart for a while, for about 6 months or so until she could come back out. But like it just happened like that. And then, yeah, I mean, we're coming up on 13 years later, still at Constant Contact. And it was just really great to, again, apply all of these things that I had been doing at a small scale, I would say, right, to a bigger company, right, that had an audience, right, that had tons of customers. And to be able to see and then work with the people, you know, going through that, like, you know, people in social at the time was kind of a different beast, and like providing content that can be used in those things. Like we won a content marketing award at a certain point. It felt good, one, to just be like, holy crap, look what we did.
Mhm.
Right. My wife and I just like, okay, this is like working. And then, I mean, to be here now talking to you, doing this stuff, and again, leaning into my skill set to be able to make this stuff happen. Yeah. Did that answer your question? I
Yeah,
forgot what the
no,
question was.
no, that was great. Like, I just, yeah, to see how you've kind of journeyed from, I guess you've always had like, yeah, like that communications. And I feel like deep down, you're a marketer. Or like you just like, you have like that skill set in you where you're very good at talking to people, but you're very good at being personable and also connecting with the company and like the business, the organization, and just understanding their mission and then understanding what it takes for them to be able to continue that mission.
Yeah, I want to add to that real quick because I think that's
Yeah.
one of those interesting things. And one of the things that I always found annoying, I think, with a lot of people that are doling out advice, right, is that, and which is why I love how we've been doing some of these Ask Dave episodes, aside from this one, but but where we're actually looking specifically at a particular business and framing the answer to the question for them specifically, with still with
Mhm.
limited knowledge. But I think oftentimes so many people are quick to dole out advice or information that they give without actually understanding what the business or the person is actually trying to do or what the person needs to do. And so in general, you can say things, but it's not until you really understand what the goal is and what the strategy is, and then who the audience is that you're talking to, that you can really say, this is what you should do. Because I could look at something from one business, like I'll just use content as an example, and I can read that and I could say, well, this sucks, right? Like, I don't like this at all.
Mhm.
But if it's not for me, well, I don't have any right to say whether this is good or bad. The only people that do are the people that you're trying to reach, right? So I think of like people in like technical fields, for example, and oftentimes those folks are very dry, very cut laced, right? Like, and they love like consuming, I don't want to say boring information because again, it's boring to me, but not necessarily to them, right? And so to me, that's always been the thing, is like, you have to get to know somebody a bit and understand what they're trying to do before you can make a recommendation, because
Absolutely.
that recommendation could be completely off, or the way that you would typically use something. Because I always argue that best practices are weird, and what you should always be trying to do is figure out your own best practices, because you could probably have someone say the best practice is this, and then you can give examples of that working for people. And then you can find people doing the exact opposite thing and also seeing success from doing it that way. And so that's why I think it's always important to take anything that anybody says as like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But then you've actually got to look at what that means to apply it for yourself.
Absolutely. No, that's great. So from content developer to director of small business success, how has your role and just your responsibilities, how did that evolve?
Yeah. So in the middle there was, director of content marketing. And at that point, a good opportunity for me to really start to implement some of the things that I wanted to implement, that I feel like my MO has been to kind of take something and then really find where we could improve it and make it better. And, webinars had come under me and things that I had been learning. Again, I'm a constant kind of learner. And sometimes I facilitate between, I'm in consumption mode where I want to take in as much as I can so that I can learn and learn and learn. And then I get into kind of creation mode where, okay, now I don't care to look at anything or read anything. I'm just kind of, again, this is kind of like that leave it at the door. I was mentioning it before. I'm like, okay, I've got all this information. Now I need to start applying and doing so I can start to learn. Right. And so, and I would say I've happily been in creation mode for a while now, which is good because I think that's a good place to be. But so, yeah, I was able to just be the one in charge of those things. And I had a very clear vision for what it was that I wanted to do and how we were going to do it. And again, we were able to build up the webinars that we would do. I mean, we would do those at a time where, we would I would argue, way too many webinars for a small amount of people. And I was like, what if we focused on doing less webinars, but focused on really promoting them and then making them awesome? And I would argue that our webinars are best in class today when the team is continuing that, who has that now. And then, we would get thousands of people coming to these webinars and registering for them and showing up. And all of it, part of another thing that I kind of embraced and kind of taught as we went through and applied was this idea of one to many, right? Meaning focusing and talking to one customer using that very specifically to create solutions for them, but then stepping back a bit to generalize it a little bit so that other people could take that same kind of framework to use for their businesses. And so I think the first kind of like thing that I put this in practice was we did this webinar and we created a 15-minute marketing series because we had had a conversation with somebody who was like, look, I don't have a lot of time and I don't, this. And then if I'm going to do it, I want to know what I'm doing. And if I'm going to have somebody on my team doing it, right? So like we took all of that. And so then we created this. I actually have a whole presentation on it. One of our presentations on email marketing goes through this. And then we call it the 15-minute email marketing plan, where tasks take 15 minutes or less for you to do. You have a roadmap for what you're supposed to do. And then it was like broken up across these groups. And that was at the time, one of our most successful webinar series, because people were like, yeah, this is exactly what I want. Then at a certain point, I became, I guess, a couple of things, right? Like one, I started going to content marketing conferences, and then I went a couple of times. And then the last time I had gone, I was talking to my director at the time, because I wasn't a director yet. And I said, if I go to that again, I think I actually should be speaking at the conference, because I'm not really getting much from going to it anymore. And then, yeah, as things happened, I was okay. And then the next time I was there, I was speaking at it, right? And so then it became like, yeah, I think I want to start speaking more. And I just started looking for opportunities to do that, whether they were through the webinars. And then we started doing some more brand related things. And I was the de facto go-to for that. And then it just built into, as we got to, fast forward to where we are today, a couple of years ago, it was like, we want to do more of that. And we used to have a field organization, which we don't have at the moment. And so I was kind of the person that, for lack of a better thing, became kind of like the face of Constant Contact in many ways. And so I represent the company doing speaking events, education. And really the goal is, and as I've always put it, I think you have to put the customer first in all that you do. And my goal is really just to help small business owners make sense of online marketing and understand and not feel so intimidated by it, and implement things that they can do to see some success. And then my hope is always that they'll want to do a little bit more and then take more advantage of the tools that Constant Contact offers to be able to do that. And so, yeah, it just became this role where, all right, what do we do so I can, one, do things like this and have a more voice within the small business audience, and continue that, and again, continue representing the company. And so that kind of led us to where we are today.
And were you the one that pitched the idea for the podcast? Whose idea was that?
Yeah. So it's funny, I've done, actually, this is the third podcast I've done for Constant Contact. And once, when I started at Constant Contact, we had done this thing called the Speakeasy Marketing Roundtable. And Constant Contact lore, back in the day, we used to do, on every Friday, we had a beer cart that would come around and bring drinks to everybody. And then we would all kind of hang out and have a drink and whatever. And as part of that, I would get a group of marketers and we would stand around the round table with our drink. And we would, talk about what's going on what are the latest headline items, right? Marketing items in terms of that. And so we did that for a while. And then we were like, okay, this is cool, but let's do something a little bit more, what do I want to say, produced maybe, where we actually spend some time talking to customers. And so we created the Small Biz Stories podcast. And that was one where we would actually go on location, and we did, I want to say like 15 or so episodes of that. And that was good. I actually wish we continued to do that. But at the time, there was stuff going on with the company where, we had, basically my attention was driven other places. And so I had to focus on those. And so that kind of languished a little bit. And then, but I thought that was really good. But I wanted to so I had always wanted to do something that was a little bit more with how we were today. And it was almost like a combination of those two podcasts, in the sense that it was like part scripted, I guess, in some ways, but it felt more like talk radio is kind of how I've always envisioned it, right? Where it's like you've got somebody talking about a particular topic, in this case, it was me, and, sharing stories and sharing insights and things that people may find helpful and useful, but then also having a conversation with somebody that's kind of been there, done that, but doing it in less of the, I guess, half narrative way, right? Where we're kind of setting up the conversation. But for me, I've always found I kind of it's almost like somebody reading a book to me if it's too scripted and I fall asleep.
Yeah.
And so, but what I love is conversation, and I love listening to those conversations because you almost feel like a fly on the wall many of those times, right? And so I was like, okay, here's my kind of vision for what this thing will be. And then, yeah, we were like, okay, so one of the things, so again, here we go. Like, what do we need to do, right? So like, all right, we're going to have Dave speak more on behalf of the company. We're going to look for these more opportunities. So what do we need to do? We need to raise Dave's profile. How can we raise Dave's profile, right? Well, hosting a podcast becomes a thing that now you can say like, hey, would you want to be a guest on this podcast? Or Dave is the host of this thing, right? So you can start to build that momentum for, and I think as we're finding and you're learning now that like this, somebody described it as a flywheel the other day. You're really creating this content flywheel where now, like, as you're doing these things, you've got all this other stuff that you can create and use. And I am using the stories in, presentations and telling those stories when I'm on panels and doing all of those things where, and we're using that content to share and then add to other content that's being created. And you just learn so much through those things that was kind of the idea. And, we had looked at the potential of having like agencies potentially do it. And then you look at the cost of doing that. And then I don't know, I was kind of hemming and hawing. I was like, no, I feel like, again, I mentioned earlier, I need to internalize things. And I was just like, I'm a big believer in, all right, you need a path, you need a vision, but you don't necessarily know what it's going to end up like. And I think, just recently as this airs, like we've finally landed where, all right, this is the intro. This is the outro, right? Like this is what the feeling is going to be. This is what we're trying to do. And now we can hone in on that. But imagine if I waited and we didn't do anything during that time because we didn't feel like it was ready. It's never ready. It's always a thing in development and a thing in process. And I think the same thing applies to when you're doing your marketing. Like you have to get going, because if you don't get going, like you need to put the reps in. There's a creative element to this. There's a craft to this that you only learn through doing and through internalizing, for me, right? Is how I look at it. And so that's where, okay, like we started doing this and, things started to take off. And I had said early on, I'm like, all right, I want to create a show that is a show, right? That is not just, because at the time, what's a little bit different from starting a podcast now from when we started like Small Biz Stories, for example, is everybody's got a podcast, right? And everybody's doing the same thing. And so how do we get really clear about the people that we're serving, which is our constant contact customers in this case? And then how do we provide something of value to them? And then how do we differentiate our show from other people's shows? And so I think where we've landed, right? Like this is a show that's really about what it really means to market your business, even if marketing's not your thing, right? And so that's really, I think, where we've landed. And, that's always been the driving force because we knew the people that we were talking to, which are, again, are small business owners first, marketers by necessity, but people who have figured it out. We're talking to successful businesses who have used constant contact and figured out what to do. And we get into the reality of what that means to be a marketer. And so, I think if there was any, not only what we hear from the people that listen, but if there was any, for me anyway, like some validation in what we were doing was, when we got the Webby Award honoree distinction, which I think I was like, okay, great. Like amazing, right? Because like, I think, there's an interesting thing here too. I mean, just from the creator, and I'm using air quotes there, right? Like the creator standpoint is that like, particularly now, people don't engage like they used to in many instances. And it's sometimes difficult to put out that stuff all the time and not always get feedback or know what's, and sometimes it's funny because you don't, every once in a while, like something will come through and somebody will say something and you're like, oh, wow. And it's a good reminder that like, oh, this is having an impact on someone. And I love the conversations that we have. I love producing this show. And I think that's one thing that has always stuck with me through all of this. Like, I love the work that I do. I love the people that I do it with, and I'm having a good time. It's fun. And I think if it wasn't, I would have to find something else because I never understood people that would, again, this leads me back to looking and working a job going like, what am I doing? Like this is not the thing. And I'm actually pretty impressed that, again, coming up on 13 years, I'm still doing this and still finding the excitement in it because I love it. Right. And I think it, again, it feeds those parts of me that are important and allows me to help and impact other people who, don't have the same skill set.
Absolutely. And I know you always tend to ask other business owners how they measure their success. So I'm curious, for the podcast, what do you look at and what do you think is successful?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think, again, it's different. And how I measure it is a couple of ways. I think one, as I said earlier, I want to create a show that is a show that has some production value to it and feels like some thought has been put into creating this for somebody. And so that's important. So for me, it's a lot about the practice. And I'm a big believer in if you do the right things and stay focused on the people that you're trying to reach and helping them become successful, everything else kind of falls in line. So for example, when I'm running the blog, for example, I never looked at it from an SEO perspective. I looked at it from a, how do we help people and who are the people that we're talking to? How do we create stuff that's for them? And then the SEO starts to take care of itself, right? And so similar with this, that I feel as though, success for me is how do I have a great conversation with somebody? And then how do we put that together for the listener? And so, I think I've told you like my little tick sheet that I'm paying attention to is like when somebody says, hey, that was a great question, right? Like, how do I have better conversations and how do I get to the things? And then sometimes when I listen back to those things so we can create the episode, I'm always listening for, was there some place that I didn't ask the follow-up question? Was there something else what did I miss, right? So that I'm like, crap, I got to remember to fix that for the next time. And so it's for those things, it's meaningful. Then it's how does then this stuff infiltrate the other work that we're doing so that we can better tell that story of our customer? Because at the end of the day, I think when you know that and other people know that, because I think another audience for this podcast is our employees. I really believe, one of the things we also do, or I also do, and you work on too, is we do these internal panels, of course, where we're talking to our customers and trying to bring our customers closer to the people that are doing the work within our business. I think that's so important. I've famously said many times to people, like the worst thing we can do is lock a bunch of marketers in the room and try to figure out the problems that a bunch of small business owners are having, because we don't have the same responsibilities. We don't have the same pressures. And we don't know what we don't know. And if we think we do, we're losing. Because the more we can do to like hear it and listen to it, I think that's the big thing. And then create things that solve for that. And it's the same recommendations we make to our customers when it comes to marketing is the more you can do to focus on those things that are important with your audience, the more you're going to have the things that you need to kind of take you to that next level. So I'm like, okay, no, this isn't going to be about necessarily bringing leads, but it will, right? At some point. But it's also, this is more about helping our customers become more successful. And so part of the measurement is, and we've started to see now as we're doing some analysis on this, I'm excited to say that as we're exposing people to these things that they have available to them, people who have listened to the podcast are then taking those actions to do those things. And that at the end of the day is the success metric for me. It's not about how many people downloaded. It's not about those things. I'm not selling advertising for this podcast, right? So I don't need to worry about that. Again, a distinction that, when you're thinking of a podcast, okay, we're going to need to do this, we're going to need to do that. But no. What is our goal? What are we trying to do? And so the metrics become different. And to me, that's the main one. Are we getting people to, one, are we raising awareness of things they have available to them? And then are they taking action and doing those things? And I think that's where we're really focused on moving the needle here and doing that in an entertaining and engaging way.
Have you seen any trends? I'm curious with the amount of people you've spoken to over the years, just some trends for successful and unsuccessful users?
Yeah. So, okay. I like it in this way because I hate when people ask about trends when they're like talking about it like future focused, like almost like what's the trend right now? Like, because I always feel like that's like kitschy. And like, I'm like, like it just makes me like, I think like, yeah, you want to tie into current events and things like that. But I don't love like just do the trendy thing, particularly right now when you start thinking about like social media, for example, and how, like, so for example, LinkedIn, right? Like that's the channel that I use a lot to try to build my profile. And that's where I'm focused. And, now they're trying to add like a TikTok element to, and so like the style of video changes to like the 9:16 versus the 1:1, right? And so it's like all these like stupid little things that you're always trying to have to like keep up with and jump through hoops just because they get an idea of something that they want to try, right? And so that's why I'm not a big fan of trends, because I think at the end of the day, what really happens is we're all people, and the things that make us human and the psychology behind that are always the same. And it's just figuring out how does the tech work to help you communicate with people, right? So I digressed a little bit there, but that's my kind of belief there, right? But just in terms of like what I've been seeing in terms of success, I think it's a couple of things. One, they've got a product or service that is actually beneficial to the people that they're serving. Like marketing is never going to help a business and make a business successful if you have a crappy product. So I think that's one thing. From there, simple things. They've got a consistent schedule with which they communicate with people. And that means like a weekly newsletter or a monthly newsletter, whatever it is that works for them. So they're doing that consistently. And then I would say they're also typically really involved in their local communities. If we take it back to that idea of relationships, most people get their business from word of mouth, and you have to be involved. You have to be out of sight, out of mind, which is why the consistency in the digital ways and the consistency with being involved in the community, these are all ways to, again, keep your business top of mind so that when I always say, when people think of the thing that you offer, they're going to think of you first. Or if somebody asks them about, do you know somebody that does this thing? They're also going to think of you first. And so that's the simple thing. And now what it is, when you think of technology like Constant Contact, for example, right? We started making that easier for people to communicate with a larger audience that they have in terms of email. And now it's, how do we even make that process of creating an email, creating a strategy, creating a plan across multiple channels, right? When you think of SMS and social and running an event and doing all of those things, how can we make that easier? How can we, one, not only help people understand why that's important to do, but also make it easier for you and remove that intimidation? Because again, these are people that, would, if you say, hey, you want to take out the trash or do you want to do some marketing? They're probably going to pick, I know what's going to happen if I take out the trash. My store is going to smell better, right? Like, you know what I mean? So it's kind of one of those things. And so those things, I think, a great product or service, a consistent communication schedule, and then involvement in the community, those really feel like some things that have been highlights for me in the conversations that we've been having.
Awesome. So Dave, just wrapping up a little bit, but so I don't want to give you a bigger head than you have.
Oh no.
But it's like, I guess I would say like.
Thanks, I think.
Just sliding in a joke in there. You're like, you're fired. No.
Yeah. This is the part, Kelsey. Choose your words wisely.
This is the part where we get to cut out. No.
Yeah.
So you kind of are in a way a face of Constant Contact. So why Constant Contact, I guess, in a sense of why are you so proud to be the director of success for this company? Yeah.
Well, I think I touched on it before. I usually say this when I'm speaking at an event too. I love helping small businesses and nonprofits. I'm really focused there. And I don't know where that comes from. I just remember being young and looking into stores and seeing like somebody standing at a counter behind a shop and there's like nobody in there. And I was always curious as to how does this work? And so I've always been curious about that. So that's one thing. And so I've also, I think, over the years, again, have leaned into my strengths. And, I think I would say a passionate person, and I can get people excited about things and do all of that. And I know that, again, this is a place where a lot of small business owners struggle. And I think small businesses are important. And particularly when, I travel a lot for the company and I say like, people are like, oh, cool, you get to travel. I'm like, yeah, but the places I'm going, like from airport to convention center and hotel and all that, like it's disheartening when you see it's everywhere USA, right? It's the chain restaurants, it's the chain stores, it's all of these things. I'm always interested in where's the local spot? Where's the place that's the local thing? Like, what's the small business like? Because that's where it's all about experience for me. And I love when you can go to a place where, one, this is a place that somebody like had an idea and they did it. Kudos to you for doing that. That's important. And then two, you're something that's unique in a world of sameness, particularly these days. And I just think that's it's important thing to hold on to and help support. And I think that's great. And what I love about it is the people that I've never met so many people when I started at Constant Contact where everybody was this really like small business. Like, how do we help them? How do we do things to help them succeed? And that's still, I think, in many ways, what's happening in, Constant Contact been around for a long time now, and that's always something that's been there. And then I also think that part of what we've been trying to do is create those tools and resources and whatever it is to help people move forward in that journey, wherever it is that they're starting or wherever they are in that journey, and kind of build on that and get to that next level that they want to get to. And so I think those are the reasons why I've been attracted to and feel good about the work that we do, because it's meaningful. It impacts somebody creating a life for themselves. And that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to look at it too. So Dave, thank you so much for coming on and letting me ask you a bunch of questions. I will say something that I just do really admire about you is how you also take steps like in your personal life to help you grow in the professional world as well. The way that you have a podcast with your wife, and I know that you touched on, you kind of started it to get a little comfortable with like the podcast and speaking and everything like that too. So just taking those steps, and also the way that you involve your kids, bringing them into the office, getting them to do presentations, getting them to work in the office, stuff like that, just getting them comfortable with that business environment, I think will definitely go a long way for them in the future. And just you love the work, and it really shines through in every episode, but just the growth, I think, of the Be a Marketer podcast. And I'm really excited to see where we go with this. And I'm so excited to be on the team with you. I think that we have a good thing going, and I love that we get to film now and that I get to be on here and you guys get to hear my voice. Definitely a nerve-wracking thing, but I do love it. I love the work we do. And I love speaking to the customers, honestly, like the people that we get to talk to and the stories and like how they started and just how passionate they are and just the commitment that they have to their businesses is something that makes the work like worth it. Yeah,
it's really inspiring. And I'll say one, thank you, Kelsey. I appreciate that. And then also I'll say, when Kelsey joined the team, being on the podcast was not something that was in the job description. And so I appreciate you being game to jump in and do these things. And I'm excited to see how not only this podcast grows as we continue to do this, but to see how you grow along the way. So I appreciate you and the effort and the ownership that you take over these things, I think is really amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me go cry. No.
We're going to have a moment now, everyone.
We're going to have a
moment.
Go cry. Well, thank you again, Dave. But if someone has a marketing question for us, where do they send it?
Yeah, well, we're going to include a link in the show notes, but you can go to the Constant Contact community where we have an Ask Dave post up there where you can go put your questions, and then we'll try to work those into a future episode where we'll actually answer your questions. You don't have to listen to me ramble on and on and on and on.
Unfortunately, I do.
Hey, that's enough. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Be a Marketer podcast. Please take a moment to leave us a review. Just go to ratethispodcast.com/BAM. Your honest feedback will help other small business marketers like yourself find the show. That's ratethispodcast.com/BAM. Well, friend, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and continued success to you and your business.